The snowy town of Hazelwood, Indiana, woke up to the sound of Christmas bells and the squeak of shoes on trampled snow. In the Lockwood home, in the center of the old neighborhood, the morning began, as always, with the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the rustle of newspaper pages. Caitlin Lockwood, a slender blonde with a piercing gaze and neat makeup, was deftly frying bacon in a frying pan, glancing occasionally at her watch. In the next room, their son Jake, a high school senior with disheveled brown hair, was frantically stuffing his textbooks into his backpack, late for the bus. Joshua Lockwood came down the stairs at 7 a.m. sharp, as he did every weekday. A tall, trim man wearing a perfectly ironed shirt and pants. His hair, dark and always neatly styled, made him look like the model family man he'd been for years. Joshua ran his own construction company that specialized in renovating and building luxury homes. His reputation in town was impeccable, reliable, committed, honest. Everything you need to succeed in a small town where everyone knew everyone else. "Are you going to be late again today?" Caitlin put a plate of scrambled eggs and bacon in front of him, a slight smile on her face, but tiredness in her eyes. "Yeah, it's a busy time at work," Joshua answered, looking away to hide the tension on his face. He took a large sip of black coffee and stared out the window, where the snow was softly covering their lawn. Caitlin didn't insist. She knew Joshua had become withdrawn lately. His work evenings often dragged on past midnight, and she'd long ago stopped hearing his phone calls, since he only talked on them behind the closed door of his office. But she shrugged off the anxious thoughts, writing it off as stress and the stress of New Year's Eve. "Dad, can you come to my game on Friday?" Jake finally came out of the kitchen, gulping down the rest of his breakfast as he went. Joshua looked away from the window and smiled at his son. "I'll try my best, son, but I can't promise anything. We have a new project to finish before the holidays." Caitlin saw Jake's face darken for a moment, but he quickly pulled himself together and nodded, pulling on his hat. The door slammed shut, and Jake ran to the bus stop, leaving a light trail in the snow behind him. After Jake left, the house fell into an unaccustomed silence. Joshua was about to leave for work when Caitlin stopped him at the door. "Joshua, you know it's been a long time since we've been together. You're busy all the time, and I feel like you're growing distant." He froze, gripping the doorknob without turning to his wife. "Kate, I just need time." His voice sounded muffled and distant. "It's a lot of work right now. I'm doing this for us." She stared at his back, hesitant to ask what was really bothering her. Joshua left, slamming the door behind him, leaving her standing in the empty hallway with a heavy feeling in her chest. Caitlin spent the rest of the day at the church, helping prepare for the annual charity dinner. It was her sanctuary where she could distract herself from her intrusive thoughts. With friends and neighbors, she always felt needed, especially in the company of her close friend, Ellen Hayes. "You're not yourself today," Ellen said as the two of them hung garlands in the hall. "It's all right," Caitlin waved away, smiling strainedly. "It's just the hustle and bustle of New Year's Eve." Ellen didn't insist, but her penetrating gaze told her that she sensed something was wrong. In their small town, rumors spread faster than snow on the sidewalk, and Caitlin knew that if she spoke up, it would become public in no time. When Caitlin returned home, she found an envelope on the kitchen table. It was unsealed and unsigned. Inside was a receipt from a jewelry store. It read, "Gold necklace with emerald stone, $2,500. Caitlin frowned. She knew for a fact that she hadn't ordered such a piece of jewelry, and this jewelry store wasn't one of the places Joshua bought her anniversary gifts from. Her heart beat faster. She carefully tucked the receipt into a drawer and decided not to mention it until she figured it out. A few days passed, but Caitlin couldn't get the find out of her mind. She began to notice other little things, strange phone calls late at night, Joshua's quick trips under the pretense of important meetings. He came home later and later, and even though they slept in the same bed, there was now an invisible wall separating them. One evening, when Joshua was late for work again, Caitlin decided to drive to his office. She stopped the car in front of the building and saw that the light in his office was on. But when he answered her call, he said he was away on business. Stricken with pain and anxiety, she drove back home without asking any more questions. But doubts were already brewing in her mind. Caitlin couldn't understand what was happening, but she felt she was getting closer to something terrible. The next day, when Joshua left again, ostensibly for a business meeting, Caitlin decided to go into his office. She knew it was an invasion of privacy, but her suspicions were growing by the day. In his desk drawer, she found something that struck her: women's cosmetics, expensive perfume, and clothes that clearly didn't belong to her. She quickly put everything back and ran out of the office with a heavy heart. Her mind was spinning with questions she didn't have answers to. Caitlin didn't know what to do. On the one hand, she wanted to believe it was just a misunderstanding. On the other, all the evidence pointed to Joshua having a secret life that she knew nothing about. A few days passed, but the tension in the house was building. Joshua continued to leave for work earlier and later, avoiding her questions and even simple dinner conversations. Finally, one night, when Jake had gone to bed, Caitlin decided to ask the question that had been plaguing her all along. "Joshua, what's going on? Why are you avoiding me?" Her voice shook, but she tried to look calm. He froze for a moment, but quickly pulled himself together. "Nothing, Kate. It's just work. You have nothing to worry about." His answer was flat, but something flashed in his eyes that she couldn't make out. That night had been a sleepless one for Caitlin. She lay in bed, listening to Joshua quietly leave the room to leave again for an unknown destination. It had been 2 weeks since Caitlin had found those strange items in Joshua's office: women's makeup, perfume, and clothes that clearly didn't belong to her. Since then, her inner world had been turned upside down. Outwardly, she tried to remain calm and continued to perform her usual duties: church meetings, organizing charity events, dinners with neighbors. But her thoughts were consumed by speculation and doubts that tore at her from the inside. The Christmas holidays were approaching, but the atmosphere in the Lockwood home was far from festive. Joshua came home later and later in the evening, each time coming up with new excuses: meetings with contractors, construction delays, contract discussions. Caitlin didn't ask questions, but her silence was permeated with a coldness that Joshua could clearly sense. He made no attempt at dialogue, only averting his eyes whenever she tried to speak. The next morning, when Joshua left for work, Caitlin decided to do some real investigating. She couldn't stand the suspense any longer. Using her access to her husband's bank statements, she began looking for signs of what he might be hiding from her. On the kitchen table lay his laptop. Normally, Joshua never left it unattended, but this time he was in too much of a hurry to notice it. Caitlin carefully entered the password she knew by heart, and to her relief, it came up. Guilt was building inside her for invading her husband's personal space, but she couldn't stop now. She delved into his mailbox and bank transactions, hoping to find some clue. At first, it looked quite ordinary: paying bills, buying construction materials for projects, transfers to employees. But it was the regular transfers to an unknown account under the name J. Davison that caught her attention. The amounts were impressive: $2,000 each month for the past 2 years. What does this mean? Caitlin thought, feeling her heart clench with anxiety. She decided to call the bank. Trying to remain calm, she called Joshua's password and asked for clarification about who the payments belonged to. The operator didn't immediately agree to divulge the information, but after persuasion, he told her that the money had been sent to a Joanna Davison. Her palms sweated and she frantically clutched the phone. Who is Joanna Davison? Why is Joshua transferring money to her? Questions flooded her mind, but the answers remained beyond comprehension. The evening was cold and windy. Joshua came home later than usual. Caitlin waited for him in the living room, keeping the lights on. Outside, the wind howled, filling the streets with snowdrifts. Joshua entered the house, shaking the snow from his coat, and froze when he saw her silhouette in the semi-darkness. "You're late again." Her voice was almost a whisper, but that made it sound even more menacing. "I told you we had a work emergency." Joshua tried to dodge her gaze, pulling off his scarf, but she wasn't going to let him go that easily. "Joanna Davison," Caitlin said coldly, pronouncing each letter with barely contained anger. "Who is she?" He froze as if a bucket of cold water had been poured on him. His face turned pale, his eyes darkened, and he swallowed nervously. There was silence in the room for a few long seconds, interrupted only by the howling of the wind outside the windows. "It's not what you think, Caitlin," he said at last, lowering his head. "Let me explain." "Then explain!" Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from the rage that had built up. "I'm tired of your secrets and lies." Joshua stepped forward, trying to take her hand, but she recoiled as if bitten by a snake. He froze in place, as if realizing it was too late to change anything. Giving up, he simply walked past her and disappeared into the dark bedroom, leaving Caitlin standing there with her heart racing. The next day, Caitlin decided to follow Joshua. Her suspicions had reached a boiling point, and she couldn't just wait and wonder anymore. She put on a dark coat and got into her car, following him at a safe distance. Joshua drove to the outskirts of town, to where there were old, dilapidated buildings that had been turned into private clubs and bars of dubious repute. She parked nearby and watched him enter one of those places. Trying not to attract attention, Caitlin followed, trying to stay in the shadows. It was semi-dark inside, and the smell of tobacco and alcohol hit her nose. There were half-empty tables along the walls, and muffled music playing in the corner. Caitlin watched from a distance as Joshua walked up to a woman with short dark hair and hugged him. Caitlin's heart clenched with jealousy and pain. She turned and hurried away before their meeting was over. For several more days, she couldn't get her thoughts in order. Whatever was going on between Joshua and this woman, it was clearly more than just a business relationship. But the sudden revelation made the situation even more unbearable. Caitlin, as if driven by an invisible force, snuck back into his office. She searched all the drawers until she found a small box hidden behind the files. Inside were photographs. The pictures were of Joshua dressed in women's clothes, with makeup and long wigs. In some of the photos, he was with the same woman from the club. On the back of one of the photos was, "Joshua, be yourself. Always yours, Joanna." Caitlin froze, her hands trembled, and she dropped the photos to the floor. Reality seemed to shatter into pieces. Her husband, was that Joanna? He was leading a double life, hiding his true identity from her. Her head was spinning, and tears covered her eyes. Caitlin tried to comprehend what it all meant. It wasn't just betrayal, it was something far more terrible and confusing. All this time, all the years of their marriage, he had been living a double life, hiding it from her and their son. That night, Caitlin couldn't sleep a wink again. She sat in the kitchen, clutching the photograph to her chest, trying to figure out what she should do next. On the one hand, she felt anger and disgust. On the other, despair and pain at having her family destroyed. She thought about how she would live her life now, what her friends would say, how the church would react. She was part of a community where everyone knew each other, and losing respect would mean the end of her familiar life. But what tormented her even more was that her husband turned out to be a stranger. Clenching her fingers over the photograph, she felt something inside her break. Anger, fear, and despair mingled in one rush. It seemed to her that there was no way out, that her life was now irrevocably ruined. She knew that talking to Joshua was inevitable, but deep down she realized it wasn't just a conversation. It was the beginning of the end. Caitlin's world had crumbled completely the moment she'd found the photos and letters in Joshua's secret box. She hadn't been able to sleep or eat since. Thoughts of betrayal tormented her, keeping her awake. She looked at her husband and couldn't believe that the man she'd lived with for more than 15 years was the same man. There were secrets hidden in him that she had never known. A week passed, filled with tense and painful silences. It was as if Joshua sensed that Caitlin knew, but he hesitated to start a conversation. Every night they sat across from each other at the table, their gazes avoided meeting, and their dinners were drenched in silent estrangement. The evening came when Caitlin couldn't stay silent any longer. Jake had already gone to bed, and the house had fallen into silence. Caitlin waited for Joshua to return from work. This time she was ready for the conversation on which her life depended. Joshua entered the house close to midnight, tired and somber as usual. But this time, when he saw her sitting in the dark living room, he knew there was no avoiding this conversation. He took off his coat, hung it on the coat rack, and slowly approached his wife. "We need to talk," Caitlin said firmly, her voice sounding like a blow. He stopped a few feet away from her and nodded silently. She got up from the couch and pulled the pictures out of her pocket. A shadow of fear and concern flashed across Joshua's face. "What are these?" Caitlin shook the pictures in front of his face, her eyes burning with restrained rage. "Who are you, Joshua? Or should I call you Joanna?" He turned pale, but held his composure. His eyes glittered for a moment, as if he hoped he could explain. "Caitlin, it's not what you think. I wanted to tell you, but I was afraid to—" His voice trembled, but he tried to keep his voice steady. "Afraid?" she almost screamed, unable to contain her emotions any longer. "You lied to me all these years! You've been living a double life, and I'm supposed to find out like this? I didn't lie!" Joshua protested desperately. I couldn't tell. I was afraid of losing you, Jake, everything we have. I was trying to be what you wanted me to be." Tears spattered Caitlin's eyes, but she clenched her teeth to keep from bursting into tears. Now she saw before her not her husband, but the stranger who'd been hiding behind the mask all these years. "What is it?" she hissed, picking up the photographs. "You wanted to be a woman? You've been leading me around by the nose all this time?" "It's not as easy as you think, Kate," Joshua pleaded. "I've tried to be me, but I'm confused. I don't know who I am. But it's never about you and Jake. It's my internal struggle. You don't think it's about us?" Caitlin switched to a whisper that reeked of chilling terror. "You destroyed our marriage, ruined our lives. And now you're saying it's not about me?" Joshua remained silent, standing in front of her with slumped shoulders, as if broken. Caitlin suddenly felt her rage evaporate, leaving only emptiness. She turned and ran out of the room, slamming the door loudly behind her. Joshua didn't return to the bedroom that night. Caitlin could hear him putting something together in his office, but she didn't care. She was shaking with fatigue and despair. In the morning, she found a short note on the kitchen table. "I'm leaving. I need time to sort myself out. I hope you can understand me someday. Asterisk." She read those words over and over until she felt the rage begin to fill her from the inside out again. Figure myself out? How dare he leave her alone with all of this? How dare he walk away when their son needs his father? Caitlin paced around the house all day like a hunted, caged animal. When Jake came home from school, she tried to act normal, but she was shaking with nerves. That evening, when he left for his friend's house, Caitlin took Joshua's car keys and checked his office again. Her attention was caught by the vials of sleeping pills on the shelf among the papers. Where did he get these? She thought, feeling her anxiety rising. She remembered the few times Joshua had come home late and seemed too calm, as if under the influence of something. But the thought that he might have been taking such drugs seemed unbearable to her. Late that night, Joshua did come home. He looked exhausted and depressed. Caitlin was waiting for him in the living room. When he entered, she was calm, but her eyes flashed with icy fire. "You wanted to sort yourself out?" She tossed him an empty bottle of sleeping pills. "Is this your way of running away from your problems?" He looked at the bottle in amazement, but said nothing. His eyes reflected a fear Caitlin had never seen before. He was cornered. "You're lying even now!" she screamed. "Did you think I wouldn't find out? That I wouldn't understand what you do?" Joshua tried to move closer, but she pushed him away and ran out of the room. That night was his last in their home. In the morning, Caitlin woke up to the doorbell ringing. There were police officers standing on the doorstep. They reported that Joshua's car had been found off the road in the woods on the outskirts of town. It looked like it had just lost control on the slippery highway. Caitlin put on her coat and drove along with them. When she saw her husband's car, her heart squeezed. Joshua was sitting behind the wheel, his head resting on the steering wheel, his eyes closed. At first glance, it looked like an accident, but something was wrong. His face looked too calm, like a man in a deep sleep. Forensics soon confirmed her worst suspicions. They found sleeping pills in Joshua's blood, and the strangulation marks on his neck indicated that he had been killed before the car left the road. Caitlin stood on the curb, staring at her husband's frozen body, and felt her whole world finally crumble. A foggy morning enveloped the outskirts of the city as detectives Sean Miller and Rachel Harper pulled up to the scene. The snow was falling in flakes on the officers' shoulders and hats, and the cold wind was blowing through. The trees along the country road seemed like grim sentinels watching the scene. Joshua Lockwood's ditched car stood half-hidden behind a snowbank, with its headlights smashed and driver's door open. Sean Miller, a tall, middle-aged man with shrewd eyes and short-cropped graying hair, frowned as he surveyed the scene. His partner, a young and energetic Rachel Harper, was already busily photographing footprints in the snow and taking notes. Her gaze slid over the small details, the stains on the seat, the broken glass, and the fingerprints on the steering wheel. "So, Rachel, what do you think of all this?" Sean asked, coming closer and warming his hands in the pockets of his long coat. "At first glance, it looks like the car just went off the road, but something doesn't add up," she answered, pointing to the driver's seat. "Look, Joshua looks too calm for someone who supposedly died in the accident. And here's another thing. There are marks on his neck that look like strangulation. That's definitely not an accident." Sean leaned closer, studying Joshua's body. His head was slightly turned, eyes closed. Faint redness could be seen on his neck, as if from a rope or cord. Rachel pulled out a small flashlight and aimed the beam at the deceased's wrists. "See these marks? Looks like he was tied up," she noted. "And there's a blood stain on the seat, but it's not consistent with what one would expect from an accident." Sean nodded, pondering what he'd heard. He'd been a detective for over 20 years and had learned to trust his instincts. Something didn't add up here. "And," Rachel continued, pointing to a bottle of whiskey lying on the floor by the driver's seat, "the prints on the bottle don't match Joshua's. That means someone else was in the car." Forensics soon finished their work at the scene, and Joshua's body was sent for autopsy. Sean and Rachel returned to the police station to begin interviewing witnesses and gathering more information. First in line was Caitlin Lockwood. Caitlin sat in the interrogation room with a blank stare fixed on the gray wall in front of her. Her face was pale, her eyes reddened from crying and sleepless nights. Sean entered the room and sat down across from her, placing his notebook in front of him. "Mrs. Lockwood, I know this is a difficult time for you," he began softly but discreetly. "But we need to ask you some questions about your husband." Caitlin nodded slowly, keeping her gaze on the table. "When was the last time you saw Joshua alive?" Sean asked. "He left last night, after the fight," she whispered, avoiding his gaze. "Said he needed time to sort himself out." "A fight?" Sean stepped forward a little. "What were you fighting about?" Caitlin faltered and her hands trembled, but clenching her fists, she pulled herself together. "It was personal. I don't want to talk about it." Sean noticed Rachel, who was watching the interrogation through the glass from the other room, making a note in her notebook. The detective knew something was wrong here, but didn't want to push too hard. "We found traces of sleeping pills in your husband's blood," Sean said, watching Caitlin's reaction. "Was he having trouble sleeping?" "Yes." Her voice trailed off. He'd been on medication for the last few months, but the detective noticed the way her eyes flickered when he mentioned sleeping pills. There was something unconvincing in her words, like she was hiding something. After the interrogation, Sean and Rachel headed to the lab to find out the results of the autopsy. Waiting for them, there was Dr. Mark Daniels, a pathologist who had worked with them for years. "We've got something interesting," he began, showing them the scans. Death was from asphyxiation, not from injuries related to the accident. Furthermore, the sleeping pills found in his system had clearly been administered in a large dose, enough to put him to sleep. Rachel frowned, studying the report. "What about the marks on his wrists?" "Yes, he was bound," Daniels confirmed. "But here's the weird thing. There are fiber traces on his wrists and neck that don't match any of the materials in the car." Sean and Rachel looked at each other. This discovery conclusively confirmed that Joshua's death had been meticulously planned. The detectives decided to return to the Lockwood home for further inspection. Neighbors claimed to have heard noises coming from the house the night Joshua left, but Caitlin attributed it to a family scandal. "Let's see what else we can find," Sean said, heading toward Joshua's office. "I'm sure we've missed some details." They searched the office and found a vial of leftover sleeping pills. It was the same drug they found in Joshua's body. But what they were most interested in was the box of photos that Caitlin had chosen to keep quiet about. "Look, these are pictures of Joshua in women's clothes," Rachel said quietly, looking at the pictures. Do you think it has something to do with his death? I don't know. But it's clearly a motive. Sean rubbed his chin thoughtfully. If Caitlin found out about it, her reaction could be unpredictable. They decided to interrogate Caitlin again, but this time with a tougher approach. The second meeting with Caitlin was much more tense. She was no longer able to hide her nervousness. We found the pictures. Sean placed them on the table in front of Caitlin. Why didn't you mention this before? It has nothing to do with his death. She spoke more and more quietly, clenching her hands into fists. We know you two had a fight. We know you found out about his double life, Sean said coldly. And we have proof that the sleeping pills found in his body match the prescription you were prescribed. Caitlin turned pale and swayed faintly in her chair. Her face became a mask of horror, but she still denied involvement. I didn't do anything! I found the pictures, but I didn't kill him! She screamed, tears streaming down her cheeks. Rachel left the room and looked at Sean, exhaling heavily. We have all the evidence we need to arrest her. But something tells me there's more to this case. Maybe, but we don't have much time, Sean replied. We need to find out exactly what happened that night. And if Caitlin isn't guilty, then who is? They headed back to the Lockwoods' house, determined to check all the evidence once again and find the missing pieces of the puzzle. The frosty morning found Detectives Miller and Harper in their office, amidst a pile of papers and photographs collected over the past few days. It had been a long night, and there was a half-drunk cup of cold coffee on Sean's desk. Rachel sat across from him, not taking her eyes off her notes. There was tension in the air, time was running out, and the clues still seemed to be slipping away. We have all the evidence, but something still doesn't add up, Sean said, running his hand through his graying hair. If Caitlin is guilty, why is she denying it so confidently? Rachel squinted, studying the autopsy report. That's the thing, Sean. She's trying too hard to appear innocent, but we have clear evidence. Sleeping pills that match her prescription and signs of a struggle on Joshua's body. But something here is too obvious, like someone was trying to frame her. Sean hesitated for a moment. He didn't like the idea that they could charge an innocent man, especially when it involved a murder with such a complex motivation. Let's look at it this way, he suggested. Perhaps we should reconsider the motive. Who else would know about Joshua's double life? They went back to the Lockwood house to do a more thorough search. Caitlin was under house arrest and the police were watching her every move. But that didn't stop the detectives. Now they focused on details they might have missed before. Sean and Rachel thoroughly searched the garage and the trunk of Joshua's car. This time, they noticed small blood stains on the inside of the trunk. Sean frowned and called forensics for a more detailed analysis. This blood doesn't match the blood we found on the seat, one of the forensics guys remarked. It looks like it's been there for some time and they tried to wipe it off. It looks like Joshua was displaced, Rachel said thoughtfully. He was killed somewhere else and moved into this car. Sean nodded. Their theory that Joshua's death had been staged was now confirmed. But the question remained, who had tried to cover their tracks so thoroughly and why? The detectives decided to revisit Caitlin and her mother's prescriptions. They contacted the local pharmacy where the woman regularly purchased her medications. After several phone calls, they learned that Caitlin had bought sleeping pills twice in high doses in the last 3 months. This alarmed Sean and Rachel. Why would Caitlin need so many sleeping pills if her mother only took them in small doses? Rachel asked thoughtfully, running her finger over the shopping list. Maybe she did use it to put Joshua to sleep, Sean suggested. But then why is she so nervous? Maybe it's not as clear-cut as we think. The next step was to re-interview Caitlin. Sean and Rachel decided to use a different tactic, not to accuse her directly, but to give her a chance to tell her version of events. We know that you bought sleeping pills, Sean began, looking directly into Caitlin's eyes. But we also know that your testimony is inconsistent with what we found in the house and the car. Why aren't you telling us the truth? Caitlin seemed to freeze for a moment, then sighed heavily. Yes, I bought those sleeping pills, she admitted, her hands clasped in her lap. But not for Joshua. I did use it for my mother, who suffered from insomnia. But then why were the sleeping pills in your husband's body? Rachel wasn't going to let her go without answers. I don't know how it got there. Caitlin burst into tears. "I didn't give it to him, I swear. Yes, we fought that night, but I didn't kill him." At that moment, Rachel noticed a subtle detail. There was slight redness on Caitlin's wrists, as if from tightly tied ropes. "What's wrong with your hands?" Rachel pointed to her wrists. Caitlin turned pale and abruptly hid her hands under the table. It's just an accident. I rubbed them when I was trying to open the drawer." Her voice shook. After the interrogation, Sean and Rachel returned to the office to discuss what had happened. "Something's not right here, Sean." Rachel looked puzzled. "If Caitlin is so desperate to prove her innocence, maybe she really isn't guilty. Then who is?" Sean tapped his fingers on the table unhappily. If not her, then who? And then Rachel remembered a detail they had missed earlier. Jake, the Lockwood's son, had avoided any talk about his father's death. He was always by his mother's side, protecting her from the press and the police, but he himself remained suspiciously silent. The detectives decided to talk to Jake. They found him at home helping his mother sort through old things. The teenager looked exhausted and depressed, but was willing to answer their questions. "Jake, we know there's been a tragedy in your family," Sean began, trying to speak softly. "But we want to understand what happened that night. Were you home when your father left?" The boy swallowed nervously and looked away. Yeah, I heard them fighting," he admitted, looking down at the floor. "Dad said he was leaving and that he needed to sort himself out, but he didn't come back." "You're hiding something, Jake," Rachel said quietly, watching his reaction. "We found blood in the trunk of the car. Do you know how it got there?" The boy turned pale, and his hands began to shake. "Yeah, I didn't mean for this to happen," Jake finally blurted out, tears streaming down his face. "Dad, he wasn't who I thought he was. I saw him in women's clothes. I didn't know what to do. We had a fight. He said he was going to tell Mom the truth." "What happened then?" Rachel asked softly. "I didn't know Mom would do it," Jake continued, sobbing. "She found him when he was about to leave. She slipped him sleeping pills, and then..." The final revelation came quickly. Caitlin, under the weight of evidence and her own son's testimony, finally confessed her anger and frustration after discovering the truth about Joshua's transgender identity led her to a fateful decision. In a fit of rage, she sedated and strangled him, then tried to stage a fake car accident to cover up her actions. As she was led handcuffed from the house, neighbors watched from behind the curtains. In that moment, Caitlin realized that everything she had tried to protect, her reputation, her family, the respect of others, had crumbled in an instant. Sean and Rachel watched in silence as the handcuffed woman walked away. It was just another case for them, but the residue of a shattered family and lives lost to secrecy would stay with them for a long time.